June 6, 1944. The beaches of Normandy explode into chaos. German soldiers peering through the morning mist cannot believe what they see. Thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of men, and an invasion so massive, so audacious, that even Hitler's top generals thought it was impossible. This wasn't just an attack, it was a deception masterpiece. And as the truth dawned on them, one chilling thought crossed every German commander's mind. How did the Americans pull this off? Before D-Day, Europe was a fortress, or at least, that's what Adolf Hitler believed. The Germans called it the Atlantic Wall, a 2,600-mile line of coastal defenses stretching from Norway down to the French-Spanish border. Concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, mines, and barbed wire, all waiting for the Allied invasion that Germany knew was coming. But where it would come, that was the mystery. For 2 years, the Allies had been gathering strength. In North Africa, they'd beaten Rommel's Afrika Korps. In Italy, they were pushing northward through fierce resistance. And across the English Channel, in southern England, a vast army was assembling under one man, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. By early 1944, there were more than 2 million Allied troops stationed in Britain, Americans, British, Canadians, and soldiers from across occupied Europe. But behind the visible buildup was something far more powerful, an invisible war of intelligence, deception, and psychological warfare. The Germans expected an invasion, but Hitler and his high command were convinced it would come at Pas de Calais, the narrowest point between England and France. It was the most logical spot, only about 20 miles across the Channel, and the Allies made sure the Germans kept believing that. They launched one of the most successful deception operations in history, Operation Fortitude. Fake armies, inflatable tanks, dummy landing craft, and the pièce de résistance, a phantom general, George S. Patton, commanding a fake First U.S. Army group that didn't even exist. German reconnaissance photos showed hundreds of tanks and planes in southeastern England, all made of wood and rubber. And Allied double agents fed Berlin credible intelligence confirming Calais as the invasion point. It was a masterstroke. Even the German spy networks in Britain, most of them turned by British intelligence, kept sending back fake reports. The entire Nazi intelligence system was being played like a piano. Meanwhile, in Germany, confusion reigned. Hitler's top generals were divided. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the famed Desert Fox, had been recalled to oversee defenses along the French coast. He believed the Allies would strike in Normandy because of its long beaches and direct routes inland. He ordered massive fortifications there, underwater mines, steel spikes called Czech hedgehogs, and anti-tank obstacles. But in Berlin, the OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, disagreed. Generals like Gerd von Rundstedt and Jodl were convinced the Allies would choose Calais. To them, Normandy was too risky, too far from British air support, too open for weather disruption. Hitler, surrounded by yes-men and misinformation, sided with Calais. So while Rommel begged for reinforcements in Normandy, most of Germany's elite panzer divisions, including the feared 1st SS Panzer Corps, were held back near Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. As May turned to June 1944, Allied preparations reached their peak. In southern England, airfields buzzed with C-47 transport planes and gliders. The ports of Portsmouth and Southampton were packed with landing ships, tanks, and jeeps. But to anyone watching from the air, it still looked like they were preparing to invade Calais. On the other side, Rommel was growing anxious. He told his wife in a letter, "The enemy's invasion will come soon, and when it comes, it will decide the war." But just before D-Day, fate intervened. Rommel went home to Germany for his wife's birthday. He believed bad weather would delay any Allied operation for weeks. That decision to leave his command would change everything. June 4, 1944, the Allied fleet was ready. But then the weather turned brutal. High winds and thick fog made any invasion impossible. Eisenhower faced the hardest decision of the war. Should he delay and risk the Germans discovering their plans, or gamble on a brief break in the weather? Meteorologist Group Captain James Stagg predicted a small window of improved conditions on June 6th. Eisenhower looked around the room, tense silence, and finally said, "Okay, let's go." That single sentence sealed the fate of Nazi Germany. As dawn approached on June 6, 1944, German radar stations along the French coast began picking up strange echoes, hundreds of small blips moving across the channel. At first, they thought it was a diversion, another Allied trick. Reports trickled in, but most commanders hesitated to wake higher command. At 4 a.m., Field Marshal von Rundstedt was still asleep. Hitler was at his mountain retreat in Bavaria and had left strict orders not to be disturbed. By the time the full scale of the invasion was clear, it was already too late. At 6:30 a.m., the first landing craft hit the beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. The sea roared with explosions and tracer fire. Overhead, Allied planes filled the sky. German bunkers opened fire, but they were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. It was only then that German generals realized the unimaginable. The Americans hadn't fallen for the same logic. They had struck where the Germans least expected, and with overwhelming force. General Edwin Rommel received the news mid-morning while driving back to Normandy. He was stunned. Hitler refused to believe it was the main invasion, convinced it was still a diversion for Calais. For hours, he withheld the panzer divisions that could have counterattacked. Those hours, that hesitation, would cost Germany the war. As the sun rose higher over Normandy, the greatest invasion in history was underway, and the German high command was paralyzed by disbelief and confusion. They had been deceived, outsmarted, and completely blindsided by America's strategy. The early hours of June 6, 1944. Rain whipped across the English Channel. Lightning flashed, revealing an armada unlike anything the world had ever seen. More than 5,000 ships, warships, transports, and landing craft filled the dark sea, stretching from horizon to horizon. Aboard them waited 156,000 men, Americans, British, and Canadians, tense, silent, soaked in rain and fear. They were the tip of the spear in Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious assault in human history. But what few realized that night was just how close the plan had come to disaster, and how carefully the Americans had outmaneuvered the German generals long before the first boat hit the sand. In the months leading up to D-Day, the American command structure became a model of innovation and precision. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces, was not a battlefield tactician in the traditional sense. He was a coordinator, a man who could fuse British cunning, American industry, and the raw courage of millions into one unstoppable force. Under him were two key American figures: General Omar Bradley, commander of the U.S. First Army, responsible for the assault on Utah and Omaha beaches; General George S. Patton, fiery, controversial, and, as it turned out, the centerpiece of the grand deception. You see, while Rommel was fortifying the Normandy coast, Patton was commanding a ghost army. Thousands of inflatable tanks, wooden airplanes, and fake radio transmissions, convincing the Germans that he would lead the main invasion at Calais. Even after the landings began, German intelligence clung to that lie. They believed the Normandy invasion was merely a diversion, a feint to draw troops away from the real target in the north. That single misconception paralyzed their response for 48 critical hours. In the early morning of June 6th, the German 7th Army, responsible for defending Normandy, was utterly confused. Its commander, General Friedrich Dahlmann, received fragmented reports: paratroopers behind lines, naval bombardments, and small landing parties. But the reports seemed inconsistent, the fog of war mixed with disbelief. At 1:30 a.m., German radar operators along the French coast saw hundreds of echoes, but they couldn't tell if it was an invasion or another Allied ruse. By 3 a.m., paratroopers from the U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were dropping behind enemy lines, cutting communication wires, destroying bridges, and sowing panic. Some German commanders thought these airborne troops were saboteurs dropped in small numbers, not realizing they were the vanguard of a full-scale invasion. Meanwhile, in Paris, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, was still asleep. When his staff woke him with news of landings in Normandy, he reportedly muttered, "Nonsense. It's just a feint. The main blow will come at Calais." Even hours later, that same phrase would echo across the German command network. It's just a diversion. While confusion gripped the Germans, American paratroopers were living a nightmare in the skies above Normandy. Planes were tossed by violent winds, anti-aircraft fire filled the air, and many jump zones were completely missed. Some units landed miles off target, in flooded fields, hedgerows, even in the middle of German camps. Private John Steele of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment famously got his parachute caught on the church steeple of Sainte-Mère-Église, dangling helplessly as the battle raged below. But despite chaos and heavy losses, their mission succeeded. They cut off German reinforcements, seized key bridges, and sowed absolute confusion in the rear lines. For German generals, this was the moment of doubt. Why were so many airborne troops committed to what was supposedly a diversion? Why were naval guns bombarding coastal batteries with such ferocity? Something didn't add up, yet they couldn't see the full picture. By dawn, the German coastal defenses were under siege. At Utah Beach, strong currents pushed American troops nearly 2,000 yards south of their intended landing zone. Colonel Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the president's son, looked around at the chaos and famously declared, "We'll start the war from right here." That flexibility, adapting instantly under fire, stunned the Germans. They were used to rigid top-down orders where no one moved without permission. The Americans, however, fought dynamically, small units taking initiative, officers leading from the front. At Omaha Beach, it was a different story. The 29th and 1st Infantry Divisions faced withering fire from entrenched German positions atop the bluffs. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery tore through the first waves. By 7:30 a.m., Omaha looked like a slaughterhouse. Bodies littered the sand. Landing craft burned. The tide ran red. General Bradley, watching from a command ship offshore, almost considered calling off further landings. But small groups of men, engineers, infantry, and rangers, began to fight their way up the cliffs, clearing bunkers one by one. By mid-morning, the Americans had broken through the first line. German observers radioed in panic. "The enemy is advancing. We cannot stop them." As reports poured in, chaos consumed the German chain of command. Rommel was still hundreds of miles away in Germany, stuck in traffic on his return to the front. Field Marshal von Rundstedt was demanding permission to release the armored divisions, but Hitler's headquarters refused. At 10:30 a.m., the most elite panzer divisions, including the 12th SS Hitlerjugend and Panzer Lehr, sat idle near Calais, waiting for Hitler's personal order to move. But Hitler had been asleep since 3 a.m. and had instructed not to be awakened under any circumstance. When he finally awoke after 10 a.m., his staff hesitated to tell him the truth. Hitler initially dismissed the Normandy landings as a feint. It wasn't until nearly 2 p.m. that he authorized the armored divisions to move south. By then, the Allies had already secured a firm foothold on the beaches. By late morning, the reality began to sink in. Aerial reconnaissance confirmed what the Germans had refused to believe. The invasion fleet off Normandy was the main Allied force. When Rommel finally arrived at his headquarters near La Roche-Guyon, he was stunned. The beaches were lost, communication lines severed, and Allied air superiority total. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, could barely put a dozen planes in the air against 11,000 Allied aircraft that ruled the skies. Every German movement was bombed within minutes. Rommel reportedly said to his staff, "If this is their main landing, then we have already lost the war." That sentence was not hyperbole. It was the grim realization of a man who understood warfare better than most. America's strategy, deception, speed, coordination, had worked perfectly. The Germans had been preparing for a battle that didn't exist, while the real one was being fought right under their noses. By the end of June 6, 1944, the Allies had landed over 150,000 troops and established 5 beachheads. But the battle was far from over. The real test, holding the line against the German counterattack, was yet to come. And when it arrived, the German generals would once again be forced to confront the unimaginable power of America's war machine. By the evening of June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy were a smoking wasteland. Bodies, twisted metal, and shattered landing craft lined the shore. Yet against all odds, the Americans had done the impossible. They were ashore, dug in, and pushing inland. But for the German generals, disbelief soon turned to fury. They couldn't comprehend how an army could cross a storm-tossed sea under fire and still attack with such precision. Now, as night fell over France, the German high command scrambled to strike back, desperate to throw the Allies back into the sea before dawn. In theory, the Germans had the power to crush the beachheads. Rommel's Atlantic Wall was designed to delay the invasion long enough for panzer divisions to counterattack within hours. But in practice, the system was paralyzed by bureaucracy, air bombardments, and Hitler's personal control. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of the Western Front, demanded permission to deploy his reserve armor immediately. He knew that every hour lost gave the Allies a stronger foothold, but Hitler refused to release the 15th Army or the Panzer Reserves from the Calais region. He was still convinced the real invasion was yet to come. Instead, the German 21st Panzer Division, stationed near Caen, was ordered to attack alone. Late that evening, their tanks rolled toward the beaches near Sword and Juno, determined to drive a wedge into the Allied line. But as they moved, Allied fighter bombers descended from the clouds like hawks. P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoons screamed in low, unleashing rockets and bombs with surgical precision. Columns of tanks erupted in fireballs. By nightfall, the 21st Panzer's advance had been shredded to pieces before it even reached the coast. One German officer, Major Hans von Luck, later recalled, "We couldn't move by day. Every road, every bridge, every crossroad, under Allied aircraft fire. It was madness. The vaunted German blitzkrieg, the unstoppable armored punch that once tore through France, was now powerless under the iron fist of Allied air supremacy." As German generals watched the situation unfold, their disbelief deepened. Intercepted reports revealed that the Americans had landed entire armored divisions, tanks, artillery, even bulldozers, within 24 hours. By June 7th, over 200,000 men and 20,000 vehicles were ashore. The scale defied imagination. General Heinz Guderian, Germany's famous tank strategist, wasn't at the front, but when he saw the figures, he was speechless. He later wrote, "The magnitude of their logistics, their ability to move and supply such a force across the sea, was beyond anything we had imagined possible." For years, Germany had underestimated America, calling it a nation of machine operators, not soldiers. Now, those machine operators were building a new army right on France's doorstep. On the beaches, American engineers were turning chaos into order. They built Mulberry harbors, massive floating docks assembled piece by piece, that allowed ships to unload supplies even without a captured port. By day 2, tanks were rolling off these artificial ports, and ammunition depots were rising behind the dunes. German reconnaissance flights, when they managed to sneak through Allied patrols, sent back photos of these harbors. And the generals couldn't believe what they saw. To them, it looked like an instant city appearing overnight on the French coast. Inland, the Americans faced brutal resistance. Between Utah and Omaha beaches lay a patchwork of hedgerows, flooded fields, and narrow lanes, perfect terrain for German ambushes. By June 10th, the Americans aimed to capture the town of Carentan, a crucial junction linking the beaches into a single front. Defending it were battle-hardened paratroopers from the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, Germany's elite airborne troops. The fight for Carentan was a nightmare. Every street, every farmhouse, became a fortress. The Germans fought from windows, cellars, even church towers. American paratroopers from the 101st Airborne, already exhausted from days of fighting behind enemy lines, pushed forward under constant sniper and mortar fire. On June 13th, as the Americans finally secured the town, the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division launched a counterattack with tanks and infantry. For a moment, the Americans were on the brink of collapse. But then, the 2nd Armored Division, hell on wheels, roared onto the field. Sherman tanks smashed into German Panthers, and the streets erupted in fire and smoke. By evening, Carentan was firmly in American hands. The German counterattack had failed again, crushed by coordination, speed, and overwhelming firepower. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel finally reached Normandy on June 7th, exhausted and furious. What he saw stunned even him, and he was not easily impressed. The beaches were lost, the skies filled with Allied planes, and the countryside crawling with paratroopers. He realized instantly that the war in the West had turned irrevocably. He later said, "We are facing an enemy who can bring his whole industrial might against us. The outcome is no longer in doubt." Rommel's first move was to try to concentrate the armored divisions for a massive counterstrike. But every time he assembled his forces, Allied bombers shredded them from above. Bridges were destroyed faster than engineers could repair them. Convoys vanished under rocket fire. The German army was fighting blind, unable to maneuver, unable to supply, unable even to retreat safely. Back in his wolf's lair in East Prussia, Hitler still refused to face reality. He ordered Rommel to drive the enemy into the sea, as if it were 1940 again. But his words were detached from the battlefield. He refused to release reinforcements from Calais, convinced the Normandy landings were a trap. Even when Rommel's reports grew desperate, describing collapsing defenses and air dominance, Hitler dismissed them as defeatism. At one point, Field Marshal von Rundstedt, worn down and enraged, told Hitler directly, "Make peace, you fool. You cannot win this war." For that outburst, he was relieved of command. Inside the German command structure, morale was collapsing. Generals who once boasted of German invincibility now watched their divisions vanish under Allied firepower. The Americans had turned warfare into an industrial art form, precise, calculated, relentless. By mid-June, the Allies had secured over 500,000 troops and 100,000 vehicles in Normandy. They were still confined to a narrow strip of land, but the momentum was unstoppable. The German generals had expected chaos, confusion, and amateurism. Instead, they found professionalism, discipline, and innovation on a scale they'd never imagined. Even Hitler's personal adjutant, Major Nicholas von Below, later admitted, "The Americans fought methodically. Their supply system, their artillery coordination, their use of air support, it was beyond anything we could match." As the front expanded, Rommel began to understand something few dared to say aloud. Germany was not fighting just an army. It was fighting a nation of engineers, a machine of war that could not be stopped. The shock among the German generals was absolute. The invasion they had dismissed as impossible was not only real, it was unstoppable. And as June turned into July, the Allies prepared for the next phase, breaking out of Normandy itself. For the Germans, the nightmare had only just begun. By late June 1944, Normandy had become a cauldron of fire. The Allies had survived the storm of D-Day, but now came the real test, breaking out of the beaches. Every inch of ground was soaked in blood. Every hedgerow, every farmhouse was a miniature battlefield. For the German generals, this was a nightmare unlike anything they'd ever faced. They weren't fighting the same disorganized enemy from 1940. They were facing a relentless, coordinated machine, one that seemed to grow stronger by the day. The countryside of Normandy looked peaceful from the air, green, lush, dotted with hedges. But to the men fighting on the ground, those hedgerows were walls of death. Each field was surrounded by ancient earthen embankments thick with roots and bushes. The Germans turned them into natural fortresses. Machine guns peeked through tiny gaps. Mortars were hidden behind corners. Every advance cost lives. American troops, especially those of the 29th and 1st Infantry Divisions, struggled to adapt. Tanks couldn't maneuver. Artillery couldn't see its targets. It felt like fighting inside a maze of green. German General Friedrich Dollmann, commanding the 7th Army, believed this was their chance. He told his staff, "If we can hold the hedgerows, we can hold Normandy." But what he didn't realize was that the Americans were already adapting. Within days, U.S. engineers improvised a new weapon, the Rhino tank. They welded steel prongs to the front of Sherman tanks, allowing them to smash through the thick hedgerows instead of going around them. It was a simple innovation, but devastatingly effective. General Omar Bradley later remarked, "Our soldiers turned a nightmare into a tactical advantage. The Germans never expected that." Soon, German positions began to crumble one by one. The Allies were learning, evolving, and adjusting faster than the Germans could react. By mid-July, the Allies were ready to break the stalemate. They launched Operation Cobra, a bold plan designed to shatter the German front and open the road to France. On the morning of July 25, 1944, the sky over Normandy turned black with bombers. Over 2,500 Allied aircraft unleashed a storm of explosives on German positions near Saint-Lô. The ground shook like an earthquake. Entire divisions were obliterated before they even realized what hit them. When the bombing stopped, American infantry and armor surged forward through the smoking ruins. German command posts were gone, communication lines severed, morale destroyed. One German survivor later described it as a wall of fire. Men vanished without a trace. It was not battle, it was annihilation. General Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the elite Panzer Lehr Division, sent a desperate message. "I have no more division. The bombs have destroyed everything." In less than 48 hours, the Americans achieved what had seemed impossible for weeks, a full-scale breakout from the Normandy beachhead. As the front disintegrated, chaos consumed the German high command. Rommel's warnings had come true. The Allies' combination of air power, mobility, and logistics was simply unbeatable. But Rommel himself was no longer at the front. On July 17th, while returning from the battlefield, his car was strafed by Allied aircraft. He was badly injured, his skull fractured, and he was forced to withdraw from command. Without Rommel's leadership, the Western Front descended into confusion. Hitler, still convinced he could turn the tide, refused to allow any retreat. His infamous no-step-back orders condemned entire divisions to destruction. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, now in command, tried to reason with Hitler. He pleaded for a strategic withdrawal to avoid encirclement. Hitler's reply was cold and absolute. "Retreat is forbidden. Stand and die." For many German generals, it was the moment they realized their leader had lost all touch with reality. In early August, Hitler demanded a counterattack to cut off the American spearhead. He named it Operation Lüttich, a desperate attempt to retake the town of Avranches and split the Allied forces. The plan was madness. The German panzer divisions were exhausted, low on fuel, and constantly under air assault. But orders were orders. At dawn on August 7th, Sepp Dietrich's 1st SS Panzer Corps and remnants of the 2nd Panzer Division launched the attack. Initially, they achieved surprise, pushing back elements of the U.S. 30th Infantry Division. But within hours, Allied fighter bombers filled the skies again. P-47 Thunderbolts swooped in, raining death from above. Columns of German armor turned into burning wrecks. American General George S. Patton, now unleashed in France, seized the opportunity. He swung his Third Army south, then east, threatening to trap the entire German force. What began as Hitler's grand counteroffensive quickly became a death trap. By mid-August, the German 7th Army and elements of the 5th Panzer Army were caught in a tightening noose near the town of Calais. The Allies, Americans from the south, British and Canadians from the north, closed in from both sides. Inside the pocket were over 100,000 German troops, surrounded, starving, and desperate. For days, the skies above Falaise were filled with smoke and fire. German convoys tried to escape through narrow roads only to be strafed and bombed mercilessly. The smell of burning fuel, rubber, and flesh filled the air. A German officer later said, "It was not a battlefield. It was a slaughterhouse." By August 21st, the pocket collapsed. Around 50,000 Germans were captured, and 10,000 lay dead. The once proud Wehrmacht, which had marched across Europe in triumph, was now reduced to shattered remnants fleeing east. The German generals were stunned. Their best divisions, the armored corps of the Western Front, had been annihilated in just 2 months. The scale of the defeat was beyond comprehension. As survivors straggled back across the Seine River, A grim truth settled over the German command. The war in the West was lost. Field Marshal von Kluge, broken and disillusioned, attempted to reach Berlin to explain the disaster. He never made it. Hitler accused him of treason and forced him to commit suicide. General Heinz Guderian, upon reading the reports, wrote bitterly, "Normandy was not just a defeat. It was the end of the German army as we knew it. Even Hitler's inner circle could no longer deny it. America's D-Day strategy, the deception, the logistics, the coordination, had worked with surgical precision. And the German generals, who once dismissed the United States as inexperienced and clumsy, now saw it as the ultimate military power on earth. By late August, the Allies had liberated Paris. The road to Germany lay open. The once invincible Reich was now on the defensive, retreating toward its own borders. For the German generals, disbelief had turned into dread. They had underestimated not just America's weapons, but its will, its innovation, and its unstoppable resolve. The invasion they thought they could crush had instead crushed them. By the end of August 1944, the once mighty German army in the West was shattered. What had begun as Hitler's confident boast, to drive the Allies into the sea, had ended in disaster. The German generals who had once scoffed at America's military power now faced a new, terrifying reality. The United States had mastered the art of modern warfare, and there was nothing Germany could do to stop it. As August drew to a close, the Allies surged across northern France. The German front lines disintegrated into chaos. Supply convoys were abandoned. Vehicles ran out of fuel and were set ablaze by their own crews. Soldiers marched east in endless columns of dust and despair. In Paris, German commander Dietrich von Choltitz received Hitler's infamous order: Paris must not fall into enemy hands except as a field of ruins. But Choltitz hesitated. He looked at the city, its people, its monuments, and made a fateful choice. He disobeyed. When the Free French 2nd Armored Division entered Paris on August 25th, Choltitz surrendered the city intact. For the German High Command, it was yet another humiliation. For the world, it was the moment the Nazi myth of invincibility finally shattered. As American columns rolled down the Champs-Élysées, the German generals, watching from maps and radio reports, realized what no one dared to say aloud. The war in the West was lost. Inside the wolf's lair, Hitler's rage was volcanic. He screamed at his generals, demanding counterattacks that no longer existed. He accused them of cowardice, betrayal, and incompetence. When Rommel, recovering from his injuries, sent a quiet message suggesting a political solution to end the war, Hitler exploded. Surrender? Never. Germany will stand or perish. It was in these moments that the generals began to see the full extent of the madness. The Führer who had once inspired them now terrified them. Reality no longer mattered, only his delusions of victory. Rommel's quiet defiance soon sealed his fate. By October 1944, he was forced to take his own life, offered a poison pill in exchange for the safety of his family. The man who had built Hitler's legend was now destroyed by it. For the surviving officers, the message was clear. The war could not be won, but speaking the truth could get you killed. While Hitler's inner circle tore itself apart, the Americans advanced with terrifying speed. Their logistics machine, the true weapon of the Allied arsenal, was unstoppable. Hundreds of thousands of trucks and Red Ball Express convoys poured through France, delivering fuel, ammunition, and rations to the front at a pace the Germans could never match. It wasn't just an army. It was a moving factory. The German generals watched in disbelief as this vast system functioned with clockwork precision. Wherever the Americans went, they built roads, bridges, depots, transforming occupied France into a forward base for total victory. General Heinz Guderian would later say, "The Americans fought a war of engines. We fought a war of exhaustion. That is why we lost." In September 1944, the U.S. First Army crossed the Seine, then the Meuse, and reached the borders of Germany itself. The once distant invaders were now at the gates of the Reich. As the Allies reached the German frontier, Panic and disbelief spread among the remaining Wehrmacht officers. The Siegfried Line, Germany's last defensive belt, stood before them. But it was incomplete, undermanned, and poorly supplied. Generals like Walter Model and Albert Kesselring tried to rally their exhausted troops, but morale was gone. The soldiers no longer fought for victory, only survival. German diaries from that period speak of despair. Our tanks are out of fuel. Our guns are silent. The Americans are everywhere. Even the once proud SS divisions, feared for their fanaticism, were breaking under the relentless bombardment. Every bridge they tried to defend, every town they tried to hold, was obliterated from the sky. In September 1944, the Allies launched Operation Market Garden, an ambitious attempt to seize key bridges in the Netherlands and cross the Rhine into Germany. It was one of the few moments where the Germans briefly regained hope, successfully repelling the airborne assault at Arnhem. For a fleeting moment, the generals believed they might stabilize the front. But even as they celebrated this small victory, the scale of the Allied buildup loomed larger every day. By October, the Americans were refueled, reinforced, and preparing for the final push into the German heartland. The German army was running on fumes, both literally and spiritually. In the ruins of Normandy, among the burned-out panzers and shattered towns, the surviving German commanders gathered their reports. Their losses were staggering, over 400,000 men dead, wounded, or captured. Entire divisions erased from existence. General Hans Speidel, Rommel's former chief of staff, later said, "We had underestimated not only America's weapons, but its spirit. Their soldiers were fearless, their machines tireless, their command efficient beyond belief." Another officer, General Gunther Blumentritt, recalled the shock among his peers. "We could not understand how they supplied, fed, and moved so many men so fast. We had believed the Atlantic was our shield, and it became their highway." For decades, Germany had prided itself on discipline, precision, and innovation. But in Normandy, they had faced an enemy that mastered all three, multiplied by industrial might and unbreakable determination. The German generals had been outsmarted, outproduced, and outmaneuvered. The realization was as devastating as the defeat itself. By the time 1944 turned to winter, the Allies stood ready to strike into the heart of Germany. The D-Day invasion, once thought impossible, had changed the course of history. For the German generals, it was more than a military defeat. It was a lesson written in fire and blood, that arrogance, complacency, and blind faith had doomed them. And for the Americans, D-Day was proof that courage, planning, and unity could overcome even the most fortified empire on earth. The beaches of Normandy were no longer symbols of conquest, but of liberation. In the years after the war, surviving German officers would speak with grudging respect. They admitted what they never could during the war. "We did not lose to luck. We lost to brilliance." The D-Day strategy, from deception to execution, was a masterpiece of modern warfare. And the disbelief of the German generals was not just shock. It was acknowledgement of defeat before a power they never truly understood. The German generals could not believe America's D-Day invasion strategy because it defied everything they thought they knew about war. It was bold, precise, and overwhelming, and it marked the beginning of the end for Hitler's Reich. The thunder of war has long faded from the cliffs of Normandy. Today the beaches are peaceful, seagulls wheel above the sand, and the wind whispers through fields that once shook with fire. But beneath that calm, the ghosts of June 6, 1944, still linger. They remind us of a day when the world changed forever, and of a moment when the German generals, once so certain of victory, realized they had met a power far beyond their imagination. By September 1944, the Allied armies had swept across France with stunning speed. Paris was free. The ports of Cherbourg and Brest were in Allied hands, and in Germany's war rooms, silence reigned. Of the original divisions defending Normandy, more than 40 were gone, wiped out or scattered. The Wehrmacht's western front was broken beyond repair. The German generals who survived tried to piece together what went wrong, but the truth was painful. It wasn't one mistake. It was 1,000 small ones, each magnified by arrogance and denial. Hitler had believed his Atlantic Wall was unbreakable. His generals believed the Americans were too slow, too inexperienced, too dependent on machines. But those very machines, the tanks, the ships, the aircraft, and the engineers behind them, became the instruments of Germany's downfall. After the war, when Allied archives were declassified, the German generals were stunned again, not by the battles they'd lost, but by the ones they never even fought. They learned of Operation Fortitude, the grand deception that fooled them completely. The Allies had built an entire fake army in southeastern England, the first U.S. Army group, commanded by General George S. Patton, complete with inflatable tanks, dummy aircraft, and fake radio traffic. For months, German intelligence watched this phantom force, convinced it would strike at Calais, not Normandy. Even after D-Day, Hitler believed Normandy was just a diversion. He kept his best armored divisions waiting for an attack that would never come. That one deception, that illusion, ensured the real landings in Normandy faced less resistance than they might have. In many ways, it was not just American power that won the day. It was American imagination. A former German intelligence officer would later admit, "We were defeated before the first shot was fired, by ghosts, by shadows, by an army that never existed." Victory came at a terrible price. On D-Day alone, over 10,000 Allied soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. Many of them never saw the sunrise over the beaches they fought to take. American cemeteries now stretch across Normandy, rows upon rows of white crosses, each marking a name, a story, a life cut short. The German soldiers, too, lie buried in the same soil. Young men who fought for a cause they were told was righteous, only to realize, too late, that they were serving madness. When German generals visited those graves after the war, they didn't boast of glory. They stood in silence, broken, humbled. For them, D-Day was not just the beginning of defeat, it was the beginning of understanding. From the beaches of Normandy, the Allied advance became unstoppable. In the months that followed, the Americans crossed the Rhine, liberated concentration camps, and crushed the last remnants of Nazi resistance. When Berlin fell in May 1945, the same German officers who once laughed at America's war machine sat across from Allied generals at surrender tables, signing away the Third Reich. For the world, it was the end of an era. For the German military elite, it was the death of a myth. That Germany alone understood modern warfare. The United States had shown them a new kind of war, a war driven by industry, intelligence, and innovation. And in the ashes of Europe, even Germany's surviving strategists acknowledged it. General Blumentritt later confessed, "D-Day was a masterpiece. We underestimated the Americans, not their courage, but their genius." Before his death, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, once Hitler's favorite general, dictated a final note to his family. In it, he reflected on the war and the invasion that had changed everything. His words were never meant for propaganda or pride. They were simply the truth. The enemy we face is not the barbarian I was told of. They fight with courage, skill, and humanity. And they fight for something greater than conquest, for freedom. Rommel's words, whispered in defeat, became a rare moment of clarity, a bridge between two enemies who, on the beaches of Normandy, had finally understood one another through war. Today, D-Day is more than just a date in history. It is a symbol of what courage, planning, and unity can achieve. It reminds us that even in humanity's darkest hour, light can prevail when ordinary people do extraordinary things. The German generals could not believe America's D-Day invasion strategy because they couldn't imagine a nation capable of such coordination, creativity, and sacrifice. But the world that rose from the ashes of that invasion, the free world, was built on exactly those qualities. Every generation since has lived under the shadow and the legacy of Normandy. And every soldier who walks those beaches today knows freedom was bought there, at a price that can never be repaid. The story of D-Day is not just history, it is a reminder of bravery, of unity, and of what happens when good men refuse to surrender to tyranny. If this story moved you, If it made you see that history is not just about battles, but about the people who fought them, then honor their memory by keeping their stories alive. Subscribe to WW2 Valor Echoes, where forgotten heroes, hidden operations, and untold stories of the Second World War come to life every week.